I think classicization is not our only option for how to deal with the ancient Greeks and Romans. It's not the only route for engaging them and thinking with them, making space for them.
Welcome to this bonus episode of Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. The last couple of decades have perhaps seen the most interesting movement around questions of classicism and temporality since Nietzsche's Untimely Meditations, a series of 4 essays from the 1870s that included his famous, at least to classicists, We Philologists. In a 2005 article published in the journal Orion, James I. Porter raised the question of classicism's temporality in the context of 8 propositions that he offered in response to the question, what is classical about classical antiquity? That was also the title of his article. Porter's 7th proposition suggested that classicism involves identifying with the past in the future perfect. He writes that, quote, temporalities of different orders are at work in classicism, the voice of the past, which is heard in the present, and so on. The competing logics of classical time, which intersect at a common point of illogic, need to be unfolded, end quote. Then in 2020, the Post-Classicisms Collective, of which Porter himself is a member, returned to this question of classical time and its logics, or illogics, in their self-titled manifesto, published with the University of Chicago Press, and there they devoted an entire chapter to the concept of untimeliness. But there has also been a lot going on in temporality studies, which is a thing, more generally. My guest for this special bonus episode of Lesche, Sasha-Mae Eccleston, draws extensively on this broader field, this field of temporality studies, in her new book, Epic Events, Classics and the Politics of Time in the United States Since 9/11. In this beautifully written work, she examines how contemporary American artists and authors have deployed classical texts, if not an authorized strain of classicism, to challenge what she calls the tempus quo. The book begins with a close reading of the organization of time, temporal rhetoric, and yes, also space, at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York. Now, you might be aware of the controversy that erupted when the museum placed a line from Virgil's Aeneid in a prominent location on the wall of its memorial hall. That line, nulla dies umquam memori vos eximet aeuo, no day shall erase you from the memory of time, is from Aeneid Book 9. It's Virgil's cap on his scene depicting the deaths of Nisus and Euryalus, 2 warriors whose violent raid raised questions for many scholars about the appropriateness of this quotation as a commemoration for the victims of 9/11. But in her book, Sasha-Mae reveals that there is much more that is classicizing about the memorial and the museum than just this explicit quotation from Virgil. She also shows how there is far more that is classicizing about the American national tempus quo than most of us probably realize. Epic Events makes substantial contributions to so many fields, to temporality studies, critical classical studies, reception studies, American studies. What I particularly admire about Sasha-Mae's work, both in this book and elsewhere, is how theoretically sophisticated she is and conceptually innovative. Our field needs more scholars who, like her, don't simply adopt critical frameworks from other disciplines, but actually develop new ones with the potential to shape thought and illuminate material far beyond our own field. Sasha-Mae Eccleston is currently the John Rowe Workman Assistant Professor of Classics at Brown University, where she is affiliated with the Initiative for Environmental Humanities, the Department of Comparative Literature, and the Department of Africana Studies. She directs the Fellowship in Critical Classical Studies for PhDs and/or MFAs, and she's co-founder of the scholarly society EOS and of Racing the Classics, a field-wide initiative for early career researchers and doctoral candidates in classics. Just a quick note that, as ever, I have posted some show notes for this episode, and also a little reminder that Lesche is on Instagram. The handle is @LeschePodcast, and for this episode, I will be posting a few images of things that we discuss to the Instagram account. Now, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Sasha-Mae Eccleston. The next voice you'll be hearing is hers.
There are a couple of ways to think about how epic events came to be. I had been reading 3 related poetry collections. The one is very well known to classicists, Ocean Vuong's Night Sky with Exit Wounds. And I had been reading that, but I'd also been reading the work of, I think, his teacher, Ben Lerner, who is a Brown undergrad, and Brown, I think, MFA, but I had been introduced to Ben's work when I was a literary arts student at Brown. And then Cyrus Consol's The Odyssey, and Cyrus Consol is Ben Lerner's best friend and also a Brown alum. And so I'd been thinking about these collections kind of all together and trying to make sense of them. And it was one of those things where I'd moved on technically to other things on my nightstand, but the 3 collections just kept on coming to me, and I wanted to understand them better in a way that felt sufficient to me. And so those were just kind of there. And then I went to see Susan Laurie Park's play. So it literally was like I just kept on getting stuck in the best nerdy way on works of art. And
what was her play?
Father Comes Home from the Wars, which is discussed in Homeland Futurity, the 3rd content chapter. And so it really was just a matter of I had these ideas and I really just kept on working on them little bit by bit. The other narrative I could tell that is just as true is that I had, started working on a kind of straightforward classical reception manuscript. And I was going to go see a bunch of monuments that were also straightforward classical reception. I bought all the tickets. I, had sent emails to curators, et cetera, et cetera. And then my first flight was supposed to be March 12th, 2020. And I had to really rethink what I wanted to do, and also thought, I don't want to put off this idea any longer. So there's a kind of COVID story that's, I won't say haunting, that sounds too negative, but that definitely was driving this project, and that I reflect on a little bit in the closing pages of it.
So you teach in a classics department at Brown with me,
Mm-hmm.
but this is a book that is organized around the concept of 9/11. How did that become the kind of animating rubric for it?
Yeah. So I'm going to push back because I actually don't think it's organized around 9/11 in some ways. It's in the title as a clarifying punctum, a kind of date that I think will get people to think about a period of time I'm constraining myself to. But as I go through in the introduction, I'm going throughout American history, ancient Greek and ancient Roman history as well, and thinking about these overlapping and coordinating forces that structure societies and structure experiences of being alive. So 9/11 was useful to me only because, again, I thought of it as a defining moment of the national imaginary and about the national conversation about American self-image, and really importantly, that it's an event known by the date. And so 9/11 is both a kind of historical date, but also as a shorthand that is a route to thinking about what time does culturally, I thought would be really useful to bring audiences into discussions with things that can seem rather high concept and abstract.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I didn't mean to undersell it. I think that it really stood out to me that you also mentioned that for a lot of the authors and artists that you're thinking with and about, the American War in Vietnam was also a really critical hinge point.
Yeah.
But to come back to this idea of 9/11 as something that we remember with this shorthand of a date, those kind of hard, cold numbers are really important to your reading of the 9/11 monumental memorial complex in New York City.
Yeah.
Could you walk us through a little bit your reading of that? I guess I'm almost hesitant to call it a space, but that space that organizes time in a very interesting number of ways.
So the National September 11 Memorial and Museum is this complex in Lower Manhattan on the site of Ground Zero where the Twin Towers used to be. And it's comprised of a museum, but then also this large glade, so, a set of trees, and then this fountain where the names of the victims are inscribed, and the fountain goes downwards instead of upwards. The museum itself houses a bunch of artifacts and some of the remains of the unidentified remains of victims connected to the building itself and the dates of the attacks and the prior attacks in 1993. And so there are tons of installations about that 1993 truck bombing, the day of, including lots of things about the first responders, but also families. There's a lot of audio and video installations. So one of the, I would say, most haunting parts of remembering that day are all of the voicemails that people left to their loved ones in their kind of final moments, either when they realized they weren't going to exit the building or just trying to figure out what was going on.
And the fountain complex there, that's meant to represent the footprints of the
buildings,
they're
the two buildings. Yeah, so I think they're basically, I'm doing a gesture that we can't see.
Which I know.
We kind of catty
which
corner.
You all can't see, but I can see, and exactly. Yeah. So you mentioned that there are a lot of numbers involved in the presentation of that day.
Yeah, the entrance installation that day, which includes this video track of people recounting that day, how they learned about the events that were happening. The people come from all over the world, and that includes the non-continental U.S., so places like Hawaii, but also just like around the world, not related to the U.S. directly, about that day, either watching it on TV, experiencing it, but then you also hear voicemails and other things from that day from victims. And you get a whole bunch of numbers and times that specify how that day played out. So it twins these really emotional memories, which seem imprecise, right, and very personal and idiosyncratic, to use that word again, hard objective numbers. The strangeness of that, of course, is time is very local, and so the time they put up is on the East Coast. It's not quite referencing this audio track and the individual stories, but it's connected. And then all of these numbers kind of come together towards the end as you're making space. So it's one way, I'm forgetting the scholar's name I quote about this, but that all of these collected stories and collected facts become collective memories, right, through using numbers as an organizing and pseudo-objective principle.
And you also mentioned in the introduction the importance of television and how that event was televised. In particular, I think introducing the concepts that you then revisit of synchronization. Mm-hmm. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's covered in Chapter 1, Instance and Replays. And in that, I'm talking about the politics of synchrony, of things that are made to happen or are perceived as happening at the same time, and how good it feels to do things at the same time with other people, and how uniting of a principle that can be. And 9/11 as a media spectacle, it really stands out in the history of television, even now in a much more media-saturated environment, in part because there was nothing else to watch on TV for most of that day once the events started happening. During the pandemic, as I was refining that chapter, I ended up watching the broadcasts of the Today Show and CBS the entire day, and watching how a story that was developing, like many news stories are when they begin, becomes the story, and the choices that were made that day to try, if not to figure out what was going on, so not to investigate, but to just stay with it and stay with people who might be affected by what was going on. That seeing something proceed even before knowing it does serve a purpose and does serve a uniting purpose.
So just like the amount of people that saw that second plane strike. The amount of people that can
see it happening live.
Right.
And yet we didn't quite know what was happening, right? The news couldn't provide us with the knowledge about anything yet. But watching something take place, that second plane hitting, and having these, let's call them emotional avatars on screen to experience it with us, and for a diffuse amount of people to go, we all just saw that just now happen.
Where does Virgil fit into all of this?
When you walk down the steps into Memorial Hall, which is, again, this beautifully cavernous and shiny space. Cutting through this, what I call dynamic field of blue tiles, which is a different installation, is this illuminated with these beautiful steel letters line from Virgil's epic poem. It just says Virgil. It doesn't tell you the poem. It doesn't tell you the line number. And the excerpt reads, "No day shall erase you from the memory of time." And I watched people kind of look at it. Either sometimes they'll like clutch their chest or they'll nod, but there's a little bit of kind of puzzlement always about like what this has to do with anything that's going on. And I admit to first also being kind of puzzled by what this quote from this poem is doing there. And there's, to be clear, no other reference to the Aeneid in the National September 11 Museum, nor do I think there should be. But for me, that again got my kind of wheel moving about what cultural work, I could say, Virgil in this poem, or at least just this excerpt, was doing here. And as I talk about in the introduction to the book, there was a bit of, let's say, light controversy when it was unveiled in the original design. And so that was kind of one of these, again, formative moments that I couldn't let go of before I knew this book was going to come into existence as this book.
So what was that controversy?
The translator Caroline Alexander famously said in this op-ed that she sent to the New York Times that the quote offered neither instruction to onlookers nor solace to the deceased. And with that comment, she was talking about the pronoun that's in the quote itself. So the quote says, "No day shall erase you from the memory of time." In the poem, that "you" refers to Nisus and Euryalus, right? And so they're assailants of something that goes not just wrong, but in the most bloody and gruesome way, and involves money. The site, the World Trade Center, is a site tied to money and commerce. But the victims of that attack were not assailants. And so to say that they would not be erased from time connects them to people who are not entirely free of blame. And she wanted to preserve their innocence as people who were unwitting victims of a terrorist attack. And so her op-ed kind of started a larger conversation, then taken up by the New York Times, that involved classicists and friends, Shadi Barsh, Llewellyn Morgan, and Helen Morales, to give their opinion, amongst others, to give their opinion on what they thought about the selection of that quote for the space. Now, the curator or the museum director did not back down. She did, however, say that the committee that chose it weren't so much worried about the poem. Right? They thought the sentiment really spoke to the commemorative context of a museum like this that was there to preserve life and preserve the memory of people over time, and that something like the Aeneid was an appropriate vehicle for that concept. And as our colleagues mentioned, that idea of preserving something through time and keeping it forever in one's mind is really central to the idea of the ancient Greeks and Romans as classicized civilizations. And so that conjuncture of immortalizing those that have been lost comes to the fore in discussions about what the museum is up to and how it's treating the events of that day.
So how does this scene and this controversy, how does this then set up the project as a whole?
Yeah, I thought the National September 11 Museum was a really conspicuous example of a larger trend in American history about the classicization of the ancient Greeks and Romans, ways that we give them, to quote Emily Greenwood, transcultural and transhistorical value, the way that we use them to set standards, to talk about ideals, to stir up particular feelings, often awe, envy, admiration, aspiration, things like that. And ways that America creates a history that is often untethered from things it would rather forget, indigenous erasure, genocide, etc. And so the National September 11th Museum, again, was a standout instance of a larger phenomenon that the book is really interested in, and especially in the way that it handles, both in the literary excerpt, but also in the experience of the museum, time.
So I'm going to pull from your introduction where you lay this out really methodically and beautifully. And I have two quotations. So the first is, this book delves into an archive of texts that engage ancient Greek and Roman material in order to disaggregate lived experiences of time that discourses of national unity homogenize. And then later on that same page, in addition to explaining how the ancient Greeks and Romans have been enlisted to structure and maintain the temporal order, this project explains that they have been used to confront how time differentially structures the experience and exercise of membership in the national community. So could you say a little bit about this question of who authorizes and who accepts the sort of national or official temporal dicta or discourse?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in the introduction and throughout the book, I reference the tempus quo, or the temporal order, right? The time at which things happen. And I think the tempus quo or temporal order is easier to think about if we think of it as the temporal equivalent of the status quo, right? The normative order of things that things operate by, that you measure yourself by, that structure your very existence and membership in any group.
Could you give just a couple of just basic examples?
Yeah, so in terms of the temporal order, there are a bunch of things structuring our very existence. The work week, as it has come to be, thanks to a lot of labor rights, is an easy one because, again, there's so much about it that structures your entire existence even before you actually have a job, that you take it for granted. Or, as parents know, right, how schools are organized, the timetable for your schools dictates a lot of things. Or a statute of limitations on a crime, mandatory minimums for certain crimes, deadlines, normative time to completion. There are tons of ways that time dictates whether or not, for example, you're a good or bad student, good or bad citizen. Drinking underage, right, can really set you up for a life of being branded as a criminal, right? All of these things that involve time that are conspicuous, or
how many
more
weeks you've been
conspicuous.
pregnant for?
Yes.
One that's come up lately?
Yeah. Right. That and those are the kind of more obvious examples, right? That we take for granted as almost, let's say, neutral parts of our existence. However, work in critical time studies, Sarah Sharma's book, In the Meantime, had a big effect on me. But Sarah Sharma's work, Elizabeth Freeman's work, which is cited repeatedly throughout epic events, makes clear that something that seems neutral or objective, like the standard work week, hits different people in relation to their relation to power differently. And it structures their life differently. So that all of these temporal, let's say, deadlines, due dates, expectations, frameworks are not just neutral part of any society structuring. They really do have an effect on people's experience of being part of that society. And so one of the things I'm getting to in the excerpts in the introduction is the experience of citizenship. And by that I mean citizenship is both a legal state, but also a state of feeling that you belong. And so how you, for example, decide, I am a citizen, it is important that I vote, versus, yes, I was born here, I'm from here, but it doesn't matter that I vote, for example. That those kind of experiences don't just have a status quo, which might be where they take place or who you do it with, but also might have some temporal underpinnings that, by being unobserved, or at least not talked about, are also confining our experience of citizenship, much to our society's detriment.
So even as the national discourse has roped the Greeks and Romans into constructing the tempus quo, the authorized tempus quo, there are creators, authors, artists out there who also gesture to the Greeks and Romans as they problematize the tempus quo.
Yeah, I think classicization is not our only option for how to deal with the ancient Greeks and Romans. It's not the only route for engaging them and thinking with them, making space for them in our making our way through life. It's been an authorized way to do so, and it's a way that serves particular agents of and institutions of power. But what I continuously found, and have found in my actual life, is that people have been thinking with and negotiating their lives in the company of various materials, including the ancient Greek and Roman materials, to various ends, and to some of those ends run afoul of authorized methods for doing so. And that's part of the kind of messiness of having the ancient Greeks and Romans in particular circulate in this country through high culture, universities, right, and low culture through pop culture, is that people are getting access to this material in a variety of ways and dealing with it and treating it in various ways. And so what I found in the kind of archive I've put together were these unauthorized engagements that pointed to what we already knew, but maybe didn't have a name for or couldn't specify was happening, that if you run afoul of the temporal order, you often pay a price. On the other hand, as I talk about in several chapters, just because you don't fit into the national thing doesn't mean you don't also make other kinds of social groups and experience other kinds of belonging, and time affords that too.
So I think that this is a good segue into maybe talking about your first chapter, the first non-introduction chapter, which you open, and I'll put a link to an image of the statue in the show notes, with a description of a statue or sculpture. What would you call it? Sculpture by Eric Fischl called Tumbling Woman.
Mm-hmm.
Could you say a bit about that sculpture and what you use it to set up? And I was particularly interested in your use of this term counter-monumental in that chapter.
So Eric Fischl's Tumbling Woman was unveiled in 2002 at Rockefeller Plaza, which is in Manhattan. And the sculpture is a woman who's nude. The head is at what we would call maybe the base of this sculpture, and the legs are in the air going to the left. So it looks like if you had taken kind of a Polaroid of someone nude doing a, somersault, but you caught them at the part that seemed most dangerous. So yeah, the statue depicts someone in this moment where they are mid-action, or they have just hit the ground with their neck. And there's a variety of origin stories for this image, and Fischl has given several different origin stories for this particular sculpture. But one of them, he says, I, like most of the world, watched the tragedy unfold on television. And he's referring to 9/11 that day. Watching 9/11 unfold all day long and just feeling myself spin out of control with all, the mind going crazy, the emotions going crazy, with all of the things that were being caused by the terrifying thing that is the terror attacks. And so it was in that moment of feeling myself spin out of control that I knew the only way back would be to create something that created a kind of solid anchoring construct, something that would articulate the feelings that would try to reconnect me to it. And so Eric Fischl, who identifies as a man, creates this sculpture of a nude woman who is either suspended midair or, again, making what could be fatal contact with the ground. Early viewers of the sculpture saw the latter. When they looked at this nude sculpture, they didn't see a moment of being suspended in the air and therefore maybe surviving, right? Or when I think of somersaults, I usually think of fun. They didn't see that levity. They thought it was disrespectful. They thought it smacked of death. They thought it did not dignify the people who had died on 9/11. And so it was covered up very quickly. It was moved off site, and it was deemed something inappropriate. And quite a controversy was struck up, in New York and through the print media especially.
Not a light controversy like the Virgil quotation.
No. What I found really interesting in revisiting the sculpture and the responses to it was a sense of, for lack of a better word, propriety that had come around. What should we look at and be made to feel with regard to the terror attacks? What was okay to be shown, and again, to be offered to react to? And even though there was no doubt that this event caused the deaths of many thousands of people, the body's place in that memory was very fraught. And especially what Eric Fischl had done by choosing a nude female body was stir up feelings of vulnerability that had not been sanctioned as part of the official memory of 9/11 and was too discomforting for the public to confront. And so by revisiting the sculpture, its initial disgrace and it's now recuperation. He's made tons of tumbling women. The Smithsonian, I think, has one. I think the Whitney has one. But also embassies around the world have brought it to their courtyards so that people could see it and spend time with it. And he has different scales and different sizes, different materials. That the sculpture ended up being this way to talk about the way that historical events get enshrined with particular sanctioned feelings and sanctioned times. So I was trying to get at this indeterminate moment of either like life or death, the suspension of time that he gets to, that is not what people want to experience. They want to know either things turned out a particular way and America will rectify it, or that there was this time before, right? The beautiful Tuesday morning that with the clear blue sky, but to be suspended in forever this moment that could go wrong was the wrong way to handle the event, according to the detractors of the sculpture. However, when he talks about it now that it's been recuperated, one of the quotes that I found really inspiring was one of the sculpted figure's hands is extended out towards the viewer. And he always thought about that movement as something meant to connect the viewer to what was happening, rather than this willingness in that the early set of viewers to push away this thing they didn't want to deal with. And so I wanted to, as I say in chapter 1, take that open hand as an invitation to think about what kind of not only emotions get tied to historical events, but what time is appropriate as we remember difficult events. And so I thought about the way that day proceeded and the way that uncertainty was handled both by a stalwart media figure. So in that chapter I read about Tom Brokaw, and by a set of poets who had different connections to that day, and especially watching that day on television. And so that's what chapter 1 ends up doing.
Yeah, I love them all, but I really love this chapter. And I love, for me, reading your account of the Brokaw op-ed, which I can also link to in the show notes, even without saying it, kind of in the way that Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is without saying it. The Brokaw op-ed is so classicizing.
Yes.
It's like so classical Athenian rhetoric.
Yes, it is.
There. That has just been so
glad you think so.
So baked in that without even knowing it, he's performing a really heavily classicizing gesture. And then you sort of as a counterweight or counterpoint to that, you bring in Ben Lerner's poetry collection, Angle of Yaw, Juliana Spahr's lyric poetry in a time of crisis, and Adrienne Rich's Tonight No Time Will Serve. And going back to your discussion of the body in the case of Fischl's Tumbling Woman, I was wondering if you might say a little bit about Rich's engagement with this concept of the beautiful death that is really emblematized by the Iliad.
Yeah. So I mention in the book that one of the first touchstones for me for Eric Fischl's sculpture was Pompeii. And there was another scholar, Randall Van Schapen, who had noticed the same thing. And in researching the cast at Pompeii, one of the quotes I came upon was about how gruesome initially people thought this idea of casting was, to watch this moment of death preserved forever, that it was distasteful and it had too much of the ring of death about them. And that response was also part of the response to Fischl's statue, that moment of indeterminacy and possible or suggested death was not the moment to capture, that was appropriate. And I wanted to think about, again, the way that other people were thinking about 9/11 and which moment was appropriate or not appropriate, or even the idea of propriety regarding which time we should be thinking about. And Adrienne Rich has, written political poems her entire poetry career. And she had written a lot about the first Gulf War. And so to watch so many of those same actors and players again be engaged in war, it wasn't surprising that she was going to topicalize it. And she's written with classical allusions before too, so that wasn't that surprising. But in these two poems, in her final collection before she passed away, I refer to these two poems as a kind of diptych because they're kind of at either ends of that collection. The first poem is reading the Iliad as if it were the first time. And in it, she's talking about trying to kind of picture vividly a scene from the Iliad where, Patroclus has been killed, the fight for Achilles' armor is on, and the two immortal horses are witnessing this carnage of mortal humans. And there's a kind of moment of pause where Zeus pities the horses for their involvement in all of this. And the poem really tries to kind of operationalize that pause. What's it for? What's it mean to stop and observe the beauty, not just of, the beautiful heroes that fall, but the immortal beings that are there? And what's that supposed to do for a reader? What does it mean in the face of so much death to pause and observe beauty? And how does it serve to remember that beauty at other times? I'm talking about it in a really kind of high-minded way. But when you read the poem, the first thing that came to me is she's talking about it as if reading the Iliad is almost like an action movie, where, you're going to kill that sucker. She has these kind of ekphrastic exclamations like bang and these kind of...
like a Western or something.
Yeah, it's like watching a Western or even Die Hard. I don't know, something less classic in the American sense.
Everyone's favorite Christmas movie.
Yeah, exactly. But, so she's trying to get to grips with what it means to take a reprieve from that nonstop assault of violence and then to return to it. And that's in one part of the poem. But then she has this other poem, this small, delicate, it might be one of my favorite poems in English, called Don't Flinch, where this is a figure of some kind. I always picture the figure kind of looking out of the window, only because they see this kind of flicker of a roof tile, and then they are frustrated with reading the obituary and decide, instead of reading the obituary, to go back to the Iliad. So it calls back to a moment of trying to read the poem before and dealing with, again, the nonstop assault of death that is the obituary section of a newspaper, and trying to deal with loss in a less, let's say, cartoony way than that original poem did. And it feels, to a first-time reader, at least to this first-time reader, less successful of an attempt to deal with the gravity of nonstop death. However, when I went back and read those poems in tandem, what I was seeing was a real discussion between the notion of what a reprieve from death could offer and this other sense of time that I'm going to call rhythm, which is mostly about not just, we think of rhythm in terms of music as a kind of measured thing, right? The rhythm. But I'm really talking about a kind of relational aspect between moments in time, and that same relational aspect that puts any kind of animate entities into relation to each other. So the moment that you notice the roof tile, and the moment that you hear your own pulse operating, the moment that you, right, she's at one point she smells something and think it might be smoke. The moment you get back to that potential is a moment that you also recognize you are in connection to other things. You're still here. Your friends might have died, but you're still here and you're still remembering them and you're still connected to them. In light of that moment in Fischl, or that moment in Fischl's reception, where the potentiality of time itself was made to seem inappropriate because it smacked too much of death, I think Rich's poem reminds us, right, about the plus side of a kind of maybe not classicized immortality, but immortality that comes from having been loved and having been connected to people. That those moments of people return in these instants and moments that are not quite predictable and that lead to a continued connection long after that moment that seems so final in death. And so I think in dialogue with Eric Fischel's statue and the controversies about it, Rich offers something that's less about those kind of things we would rather forget and are really uncomfortable about mass loss, and about something that might seem a little hokey, but that is about the promise of being connected in community with people. And that was and still remains a central animating force to being in any society.
So in some ways, even if you resolve the moment of Fischel's statue, that time doesn't stop when that moment is over.
No, and you're never going, as a mortal being, you're always going to confront, memento mori. You're never going to get away from that indeterminacy of I'm alive right now, but I don't know what's coming next. Yes, in moments of national trauma, to be reminded of that can seem inappropriate. But what other time is there to remember about continuing connections with not only the people that have died, but that remain to be connected to in this indeterminate future?
There is a line I'll read from this chapter, which I thought was really powerful and is very helpful for getting, I think, what you're arguing here, where you write that made to witness horror after horror as the war of terror continued, which is another big aspect of this, about how this was protracted. Lerner, Spahr, and Rich rejected the affective resolution offered by the Bush administration, and also Tom Brokaw, via the television news and other media industries. Could you maybe gloss that sentence a little bit?
Sure. I think the chapter argues and makes a good case for, and it's not a unique argument, that the quick escalation from the terror attacks and the grief over the horrific deaths to the global war on terror seemed to promise a sense of closure, and closure in the sense of, if not revenge, then in at least American eyes, justice. And that the narrative would make sense. And instead of loss and instability, justice, as dispensed by the Bush administration, would restore the normative order that is American invulnerability. What I was seeing in these poems was a return to vulnerability, not as retribution and not as justice and not as something that puts an end to things, but as this ongoing negotiation of what it meant to be part of anything that is open to uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, the connection to people that, yes, could be lost was something beautiful and to be celebrated. Not because how that loss came to be should not be talked about, but that the justice itself wouldn't bring them back and wouldn't make those relationships that still existed any stronger. And so there's, again, two different, or a variety of ways of dealing with those destabilizing feelings of something like a terror attack, and those destabilizing feelings that come with saying, hey, what does it mean to now be in a nation that defined itself by its invulnerability, but now that that's not true, at least today, what do we have? And I think in the contemporary moment, and maybe let's say the last year, watching lots of natural disasters come together, there's a kind of, the rush to good news can feel really disrespectful sometimes, right?
I always feel bad for Gayle King when she has to do that pivot.
We should feel bad for Gayle King having to do a lot of things.
Agreed.
Right? So the rush to good news can feel like a cover-up for infrastructural deficits, for thinking about the way that our society is not structured actually to take care of people, that you're on your own, et cetera, et cetera. However, those good news stories, often about communities pulling together, blah, 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 also remind us of this potential that's always there and the insufficiency, or in some political philosophies, the impropriety of government messing with that fundamental connection to other people and the possibilities of collaboration, self-sufficiency, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this notion of belonging and having recourse to these different communities is, again, one that we're constantly dealing with. And sometimes it counts as the national thing, and sometimes it doesn't.
Well, another aspect of the Bush-Brokaw line that I think will get us in, I know we're getting short on time, but I do want to talk about aspects of chapter 2 here on the concept of synchronization. So your really powerful argument about Brokaw's argument that, and also I think the broader Medea Bush narrative was about this sort of assimilation of everyone in America at this time, at this moment, that this kind of assumption that we, whatever that means, that everyone here was all in lockstep now, was all on the same page with the same values.
That's right.
This foregone conclusion that everybody was going to be with the Bush administration with whatever it decided to do afterwards. And this returns us also to that moment of people around the world watching the second plane hit and standing still together and synchronization. Could you speak about that concept as you use it to structure chapter 2, and in particular your reading of Jesmyn Ward's Salvage the Bones, her second novel?
Yeah. So in the first content chapter of the book, Instants and Replays, I make an argument for thinking about, again, the mainline response to not only the terror attacks, but watching the terror attacks on the news through the temporality of synchrony. That synchrony can often cover as a way to enforce unanimity, a simplistic kind of unity that often allows you to skip through a bunch of processes essential to democracy. If you assume everyone thinks the same, why would you need to go through procedures that take a long time? You can rush through and get through decisions like resolutions to war quite quickly. And so it became really useful to the Bush administration to talk about kind of universal calls for justice, resolute determination, to act, that to behave slowly would be, right, to not help the American people. And that somehow, by having watched this thing happen all at the same time, this could be the route towards creating a totally unanimous republic.
Yeah, could I just read really quickly, because I actually pulled this quotation from your page 16, where you write, "Preferring speedy decisiveness over meaningful deliberation also meant, among other things, curtailing how democracies work, despite the pretenses of a war effort trying to effect humanitarian peace by spreading democracy worldwide." Yeah, this is one of the central arguments about speed as the time frame of the Bush administration, or also of capitalism. But I complicate that in the intro, right? That it's one of the temporalities at play, because I think the tempus quo is a coordination of various temporalities, again, based on one's relationship to power and the need of different institutions. But if the Bush administration really wanted to operationalize synchrony, and media figures that were supporting the Bush administration also tethered synchrony to patriotic feeling, what happens in Katrina, just some 4 years later, Hurricane Katrina that devastated the Gulf Coast? Synchrony's evil twin, asynchrony. So this chapter on Katrina and Jesmyn Ward's novel Salvage the Bones is about the politics of asynchrony, and it's called Out of Sync. And it talks about when a community is marked by not sharing the same time frames and the same affects as the national community. And it goes into not only the Mississippi fictionalized community that Jesmyn Ward writes about, but also on New Orleans, and how New Orleans has been treated, as I call it, temporally exogenous, foreign, for a long time.
Sometimes that could lead to a great commodity because then you can sell it as a vacation place, as a place where you're not bound by your temporal strictures, right? And also behavioral strictures. But that also might mean they don't prepare like they should. They don't think about the future like they should.
Because they're all celebrating Mardi Gras.
They're just celebrating Mardi Gras.
Sort of dressed like zouaves.
Or poor rural people, they move slow. They're backwards, right? And those characterizations, as I show in this chapter, but as I hope I do a good job of showing up in each chapter, are not only about the rhetoric, things that we say about people, but they're persuasive in that they create material conditions that structure people's lives. And so blaming people for their lack of preparedness, calling them backward versus talking about the socioeconomic conditions under which they have existed and have learned to exist, then outs the government from paying their insurance policies, structuring healthcare in a particular way, et cetera, et cetera. And Katrina, as one particular event, comes at the tail end of a whole bunch of environmental policies, residential policies, racializing policies that have structured lives in such a way that the kind of preparedness sanctioned by the American government, which is mostly consumerist, is not available to a lot of people. Then how do you prepare? And if your forms of preparing are not viewed as valuable, what happens when a place your family has lived in for generations, you become, as happened in the wake of Katrina, a refugee in the country of your birth? What rights do you have then? And that chapter is really obsessed with taking up that question again of what it means to operate differently when you don't abide by the normative work week, when you are a teen mom and therefore get pregnant at the wrong time, when you are interested in something that people will say is a hobby but not suitable for a job, when your wife dies at the wrong time for you to maintain, right? All of these ways that they've been marked as temporally different comes to a head in the most, I think, spectacular way, but also in a way that, because of Ward's brilliant writing, comes to grips with a whole host of issues attached to Black rural living in the American South.
So I know that the matter is extremely complex, and you point out in this chapter that Jesmyn Ward's use of Medea here is even more complex than the classical scholarship has previously allowed. Could you maybe, though, just gesture at why you think Medea was an interesting and powerful figure, both for her to think with, and then now also you to think with in the concept, in the context rather of the broader project of this book?
Well, in the book, I go through two particular things that are useful. One is the textbook, I guess, Edith Hamilton's textbook that Jesmyn Ward had used as a child that continues to be circulated, I believe. Oh, yeah. My version's pretty old.
Yeah, so her Greek myth compendium. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the anthology of Greek myth that Jesmyn Ward was familiar with, and that her fictional character, Esh, has to read for her summer reading, is really important and meaningful, and I don't want to give too much away about that argument. But I think Medea is really a great figure to think with in this particular case, especially because Jesmyn Ward's narrator is a young woman who discovers, spoiler alert, that she is pregnant fairly early into the novel, about motherhood, its role in the maintenance of society, but also the norms attached to it, the dictates about how women's activities and bodies are policed and maintained, and in particular about the ability of motherhood to disrupt a whole bunch of societal scripts upon which the society is based around the reproduction of itself. And so motherhood is indispensable for the maintenance of society, but it's also poised to disrupt a whole bunch of societal controls. And so Esh's pregnancy and Medea's pregnancy end up offering a bunch of things to think with about the kind of autonomy that is not useful to societies that want to maintain control.
And again, without giving too much away, could you just say a little bit about this section heading or section title that I just absolutely love, which is Medea, temporal technologist.
Yeah, so I wanted to go through a bunch of different Medea myths because I think Matthew Wright has written a book chapter, I believe, called What Makes Medea Medea. And I've written with two of our graduate students, Claire Kearns and Matt Carley, about a graduate seminar I taught on making Medea Medeas. But the history of the adaptation of Medea, like so many other characters we know from ancient Greek myth, has made it seem like these figures are unitary entities, that they have one story. There's a true story and everything else is an adaptation or something. And your guy, Euripides, is usually the Medea people think about, right? And judge other Medeas by. But there are so many different iterations of Medea's story, even in the ancient Greek and Roman literary canon.
I would say my guy is Neophron.
Okay.
Euripides is James Dickles, episode 9 guy.
Okay, distance yourself. But, so many people think of Medea as the Medea as Euripides' Medea. And so they therefore think of Medea as someone who commits infanticide. That's her story, right? And as Shelley Haley reminded us many moons ago, right, as she was trying to get to the core of the relationship between Medea and Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, that there's a whole range of Medeas. And if you, for example, change the definition to someone who was trying to keep people alive, that gives you a window into a bunch of variants that are really interesting. I could flip that slightly or update it, having read Salvage the Bones so many times now, to how Ward writes it, which is that for so many of these versions, Medea is someone for whom love goes wrong. And if you define her efforts to save as things that go kind of wrong instead of things that are meant intentionally to kill her children, that opens up a whole bunch of interesting terrain into her actions. In terms of, as you allude to, as I put in the book, her temporal technology, I'm building on work in classics that has pointed to some of her strategies for avoiding some of the constraints on her behavior. And I'm using kind of spatialized language there. And some of that is spatial about how she, for example, as a lot of tragic women have to negotiate how they deal with the house and their role in the household. She negotiates that space really cleverly. But she's also dealing with and manipulating delays really well. She's making people get out of step with her and capitalizing on these small moments that even, are written to the play. For example, Seneca's play saying, like, what could she get done in a day? Well, she could destroy your whole family.
Right.
She could destroy multiple generations of family, right? And so I wanted to deal with what happens when you harness that kind of ability. And let's say the phrase I use is temporally disaffiliate with the norms of a society. What if you decide, as Esch eventually does, that being a poor Black teen mom isn't the end of your story? That being pregnant at the not sanctioned time to be a normative and good American woman does not fully end your story, and it doesn't make you, especially she's a teenager, a bad person. How can you, again, to use Ward's words, make the love go right and build on community that is not about those strictures, and thereby temporally disaffiliating from one of that constraint or some of the other constraints around what preparedness might look like? How do you then get in sync with a community that might operate differently than the national thing, but that operates for its benefit, first and foremost? We don't get to see Medea in ancient stories get to experience that kind of thriving. And I think Ward wanted to write a version where someone who temporarily disaffiliates doesn't just do so at their detriment.
Well, Sasha-Mae, let me ask you then, what are you hoping, since this is really a classics podcast, I guess I'll frame it in this way. What are you hoping that classicists take away from this book?
That's a great one. I think the thing I hope classicists take away from this book is actually quite simple, in that we tend to think of space as a useful analytic, both in our work, but also in our life work. For example, we often think about if we want diversity, we have to put quote unquote diverse bodies. I'm rolling my eyes. Diverse bodies in the spaces where things happen, right? And I'm thinking time is also a useful analytic for thinking how we create sustained communities, how we improve them, make them more just. And that might mean, again, thinking like things over like normative time to completion, which I mention in the envoy to the book. But yeah, so I'm really interested in what happens when we add time as an analytic to how we study literature writ large, but also ancient Greek and Roman literature in particular. For those of us, especially that study gender a lot, this is, I think, foundational to thinking about how female characters are treated often in the stories and the poems and so on that we're reading, that kind of just gets taken for granted, especially to our students who might not yet think about how old is this character? What happens when she transitions into a different part of life? What can she expect in a different part of life? These kinds of questions about the lived experience indexed by the text we study. So that's the kind of major issue, to think of time as an analytic. But I think in the longer term, my hope is for us to think about the kind of communities that we are creating by knowing this stuff, and how those communities of knowing might operate in relation to the university a little differently.
What do you mean by this stuff, just to clarify?
Ancient Greek and Roman material. That communities of knowing ancient Greek and Roman material might operate a little more flexibly or in different relation, both to the university and to the other communities that are invested in it. And I think, again, we've now entered a space of media saturation, that there is a little more attunement to not being so fixed in space. But I think thinking about the various ways communities are bound by time might also be really revolutionary, if I might be so idealistic.
I think there are so many levels on which this book has the power to just change how people think about things. And as I was telling you, in the pre-recording, that already I'm working on this kind of boring commentary, like Kyrgyz's against Leocrates, but that your book has really changed how I'm thinking about and reading the depictions of the Athenian reaction to the news of their defeat in the Battle of Chaeronea. Mm-hmm. This is just like this extremely concrete application where Demosthenes and On the Crown makes a lot of hay out of this notion that Chaeronea was a 3 days journey away, and 3 days was exactly the amount of time that Athens needed to recover from its panic and make a plan. Mm-hmm. So I just... already it's really having this very concrete effect on my thinking. But I think that in a way that's almost, it's not even because it's classical. It's just because now I'm seeing better, just whatever I'm looking at in the everyday through the lens and through the conceptual framework that you provide here.
I also think, as I mentioned in the envoy at the end, that it's useful to think about the pandemic, because it was such a strange thing and strange and protracted thing that many of us experienced in a particular way, but not all of us experienced in the same way. And I say that as at the front of my mind is as a teacher in thinking about the different trends in education that were spotlit by the pandemic, but didn't originate there. The intensification of certain problems and certain trends in learning, literacy, access, etc. And I think we haven't really dealt with it, certainly not as a nation, but not even as a field, really, in thinking about what that, I won't call it a timeout because the pandemic was labor intensive in so many ways, but what that time out from a lot of the normative rhythms that we had been accustomed to as members of the universities, as members of families, as employees, etc., as patients, that reckoning with it offers so much promise for restructuring American society in ways that could be truly beneficial. And then I also have to mention the other big, I think, temporal concept that is looming over everything, I think, in the United States, especially since the wildfires, is climate change. another large-scale event that will have differential impacts based on your relationship to power and wealth, that is kind of, to use a horrible reference, but a kind of ticking clock, right? What is the moment upon which there is no return? And then what do you do after that? And again, this is another thing, not just for the field, but us as human beings on this planet, that we just haven't reckoned with in any large way. And a part of me wonders if part of that reckoning is because the climate change almost makes nations moot in the way that the pandemic made nations moot.
And then to just end with the traditional podcast game, every podcast has got to have a game.
Does it?
Sure does. It's a genre. Genres have rules, Sasha-Mae. Okay, so I'm going to throw out just a few words, and if you could just say whatever comes to mind first.
Okay.
So the first here is Medea.
Oof, babies.
Rhythm.
Hands.
Chronopolitics.
Sarah Sharma.
Tumbling woman.
Death.
Time.
The endless void of space.
You said space.
I know. Outer space is one of my deepest, darkest fears.
Okay.
I often have nightmares about being at an event horizon where you don't have time or space. It's one of my deepest fears.
Oh, goodness. Well, a new thing for people to worry about in case you never thought of that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Sasha-Mae, so much, both for the book and for coming on the podcast and the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.